Welcome back everyone. This is going to be a two-part series where we finalise the installation of our lawn irrigation. We've been working away on this for about 12 months, on and off as we've had the time to do it, and it's finally done. So part one will take you through what we've learnt along the way and get into how you go about doing it, the design, the layout, the process and the parts. In the second episode, we'll go through the installation to show you all the tips and tricks we've learnt along the way. Come along and we'll show you how. So you'll end up with a whole pile of boxes full of all your kit and gear to do your irrigation install. But firstly, we need to get some planning done. So let's run through the steps to make sure you get it right. Now before you get into the design, there's one important factor you need to consider, and that's the pressure and flow from your selected water source. Most people would use a hose tap, and in which case you want to do all your testing from that point. In our case, we've got a spear point, and we've got a pump that we know flows at 100 litres per minute, and we use that as a basis for all our calculations. Now when it comes to town water, it's very important to test not only the flow, but the pressure. This allows you to select the most appropriate irrigation fitting and allows you to determine the maximum number you can run in each zone. So when it comes to testing this pressure, I think the best way is to get a pressure and flow device. Now you can buy this online from an irrigation supplier or hardware store. If you're going through an irrigation supplier, they will probably come out and test it for you using their own calibrated equipment. If you want to do it yourself, there's a lot of videos around on how to properly use those pressure and flow devices. The simplest method, which we're going to demonstrate here today, is to do the simple bucket test. Now this won't test the pressure, but it will give you a flow rate that you can use to base your design on. All you need is a bucket. Something around about the 10 litre volume would be perfect. I've got an 11 litre pail here, and I've got a known measuring device where I've measured out 10 litres and put a mark just in the top of the bucket. That way I know when I get to the 10 metre mark, I can stop my timing. The other thing you need to have on hand is a stopwatch or other time measuring device. So what we do here is we run the tap till it fills up that 10 metre mark. We want to time how long that takes, and that will allow us to determine our flow in litres per minute. So it's a simple case of getting your stopwatch ready, turning on the tap and timing how long it takes to get to that 10 litre mark. So let's go. So that quick test identified it took roughly 20 seconds to fill up 10 litres in the bucket. So assuming my mathematics is correct, that works out to approximately 30 litres per minute. So if this was our situation, we'd use that as a basis for our design, but I really think to do it properly, you want to get one of those pressure and flow devices or get someone around to properly test it for you. That gives you a perfect baseline to base your design on, which we'll get into right now. Now it pays to have a look online, as most manufacturers have some excellent online resources. For example, Hunter Industries, who we're using for most of our gear, have this very handy and useful residential sprinkler design and installation guide. This is a very comprehensive document which takes you through planning your system, to selecting your sprinklers, to the installation, and includes some really handy illustrations and diagrams. It's a good idea to break your areas down into similar width zones. That way you can select the most appropriate sprays or rotating nozzles to best irrigate the area you're trying to treat. So as a simple starting point, you want to match the width or the depth of the area you're trying to irrigate with the radius of a sprinkler which best suits that range. For this example, we're going to use our main side yard that you would have seen in the introduction to this episode. Firstly, we identify the area we wish to irrigate. So in our case, we've got a large septic mound off to one side that we don't want to water, and we're going to irrigate out from the house and around the corner of the shed. The first step is to lay a grid over the area you're looking to irrigate. In our case, a 9-metre grid works extremely well. You then look to place your sprinklers at the intersection points of these grids and around the perimeter of the area you're looking to irrigate. You then start overlaying the radius so you can start looking and evaluating your overlapping patterns. So we'll start with the 360-degree radius first. Now we have the 180-degree patterns, which are generally along the outside perimeter zones. You then have your corners, which are typically 90 degrees. However, we have a few 270 degrees where we're sweeping around the corner of the shed and into a third zone, which goes off to the bottom right-hand side of the screen. And with the final diagram, you want to see reasonably consistent patterns, and that will ensure you've got adequate coverage and fairly consistent water distribution. So you can see with ours, we do have some slightly drier spots off to the sides or where we've got these awkward spaces, which you're typically going to have because you're going to spread it out where you need to, because not everything's going to be to that exact consistent grid. The next step is to start looking at your pipework, and I'm going to keep it very simple here because there's a lot of factors in play. But essentially you want to appropriately size your pipework depending on the flow and head pressure that you need, depending on the type and number of sprinklers that you're using. But the most critical thing is how your pipework is laid out. So the typical way to do it is a T system where you run your pipework up through the middle and you branch out to your sprinklers on either side. The alternate method is the U, where you're splitting the water from one side to another. What you want to avoid is running them in series. That is, the water is flowing from one sprinkler to the next, to the next, to the next, kind of like how string lights work. But what's happening is you're losing water pressure every time you go past another one of these sprinkler heads. So what we're doing for each of our two zones here is we're going on a variation of the U method where we're actually connecting it to make it a full loop for each circuit or zone. So zone 1 goes all the way across to our septic mound, up to the fence line, back across to our fence line on the right hand side, across past the shed, and it can keep going in that continuous loop around and around and around, and that alleviates all the dead ends and the variances in water pressure as the water is flowing around. Our second circuit does essentially the same, except it's slightly shorter, and that happens on the bottom side. So you can see while everything is laid out in the perfect grid, you end up with two long rectangles essentially, which are your two separate zones, with nothing in between through the middle portion of where our shed lies. From here, it's a matter of connecting each circuit up to your water source. So in our case, we have a manifold on the back side of the shed, and we run our pipework in trenches to the appropriate zones. It's important to look into the future. So at this point, while we had the trenches dug, we also put in some additional lines to service our outside verge area whenever we got a chance to get up to that point. So that alleviated having to dig up the trenches once more to lay the pipe back out to these extremities of our block. And I think it's something to consider while you're not necessarily going to do it all at once. To future-proof it and put the pipework through where you're already digging is a very, very good idea. Now, once you've got your design roughly sorted out, I highly recommend you go down to your local irrigation supplier and have them have a look over the plan, tweak anything that needs to be done, and then guide you on exactly what you require and what you need to do. What you will find is once you get all your supplies and come home, you'll end up with a big box of parts, and it can get quite bewildering. So what I've done is I've just laid out our sample circuit that we're doing as part of this episode, just to run you through all the parts involved and to hopefully simplify the process down for you. Now, it generally comes down to three fairly critical parts. The first is your controller. So we have a simple Hunter X-Core 8-station controller. It's nothing fancy, it's not wireless or anything like that. You can program it, you can do whatever you need to do, and it just sits on the wall in the shed here. From the controller, you're going to have to control each of your circuits using a solenoid, something similar to this. Now, it is essentially an electronic ball valve. So it controls the water coming in and tells it when it can go out into the specific circuit that you want to water at that period of time. The third component is obviously your pop-ups. So depending on the size of your block and what you're trying to water, there are a whole heap of variations of pop-ups. Now, as we stated before, you only want to do this once, so go for a really good brand that is reliable, that you can trust, and most importantly, is also serviceable. So in our case, we're doing quite large areas, so we're using these Hunter Industries PGP rotators. You can get them in a few various sizes, and my understanding is you shouldn't mix and match different watering devices. So in our case, we can actually mix and match various sizes of the PGP rotators, but we wouldn't try to incorporate some other sprinkler head that isn't a rotator type. It just unbalances the cycle and the pressures that you're running through the system. So my original thinking was that your sprinkler heads simply screw on to a T-piece or some other connection onto your pipework, similar to how you do your garden sprinklers. But it's a little bit more complicated than that, and it's just so that you can get everything all balanced and positioned right in your lawn so it's all set nicely. So what you will also probably get if you're doing a high quality system such as this is you will have a T-piece joiner that goes into your pipework. Now that will have usually an adapter onto it, and then this U-shaped series of pipework with elbows and straights that is called a riser. Now what it allows you to do is the pipework can run through in the trench, and then locally where you've got your sprinkler, you can actually adjust the depth and the size of that trench to level the sprinkler so that the top of the head is flush with the soil line. You want to make sure this is down far enough so it is definitely at the soil line. If you have it sitting up level with the top of your turf or your grass, it's going to get damaged. When you mow it, you'll take the top off it, and you don't want to do that because these are quite expensive items. So it looks like a lot, but it's a very, very simple system once you put it all together and work out how it all works. You simply dig the trench through. We generally sit it down about 200 mil. You're then backfilling on top of it anyway. You can also peg the pipes in, but we find that once you've got the weight of the water in there, it doesn't tend to move around anyway, even with the soft loose sand that we've got here. If you've got a heavier base soil, that's going to weigh it down even more. Now just remember, it's not going to be an easy task of just cutting a trench through. You will uncover things such as pipes, roots, all sorts of obstructions, so that your pipework may have to go up and down a little bit, depending on if you can actually cut through or work around those obstructions. Now we're using 25 mil blue stripe thick wall irrigation pipe. And it works in conjunction with your high quality compression irrigation fittings. You simply put the pipe together with all the collars and then tighten it all up. And that works really well. There's a number of different brands you can get. We use Plasson. It's what our local irrigation place supplies and recommends. Now there is another option you might want to consider, and that's to use a thin wall pipe. And it has these sort of locking on fittings, more like your normal garden irrigation. I know a lot of people use it with great success, but again, it's a theory. You want to do it once, you don't want to dig it back up. That's why we use the 25 mil thick wall pipes and compression fittings. So this stuff you can get from your local hardware store, Bunnings, stuff like that. You won't be using the fixtures that we're using here. So if you are thinking about doing a thin wall system, this probably won't apply so much as far as the actual products that we're using. However, the layout will still give you a guide on what you need to do. Anyhow, we'll step in now and I'll run you through the circuit and how it all sort of works. Now don't be scared. It's really quite simple once you work through it all. So here, I've got our simple loop system, which we're going to do up the side of our driveway. It's exactly the same how we set up our main systems in front of the shed here, and generally applies to nearly everything that you do, unless you're doing a T-based system where you run a main line and you're running T's with dead ends off the end. As I discussed in the design stage, I think it's a lot better from a fluid dynamics point of view to run the water in a continuous circuit around and around and around, rather than shooting off and going to dead ends. Getting into the simple circuit. So what you have is a solenoid or some kind of device which can control the flow to the circuit. From there, you'll usually have your pipework, and there you have a series of T's with compression fittings on all three sides, and a series of elbows, again with a compression fitting on each end. And that will start the rectangle sort of shape or the circuit that you're doing. And that allows the pipework to go one way and then to cut across and return back around the other way. And then you start placing your sprinklers along. And remember, this is spread out, in our case, about 20 meters. So there's a lot of pipework in between, and it doesn't really take that long to put together. Now your solenoid could be located in an underground box close to the actual circuit itself, but just remember, you then got to run your cables, your electrical cables, all the way back to your controller. Or what we do is we've got a manifold on the outside wall of the shed, which I will show you, and all our solenoids sit off that manifold. We've got a simple wiring harness that goes into the controller, and then we run the pipework from these points to all the areas of our yard. So that in our case was a simpler solution to it. I think it just makes a little bit more sense from a servicing point of view. They're all there, you can test them all, see what's going on, and then from this point onwards, it's just pipe work. Now when we get out and start installing all of this, it'll make a lot more sense. But I just thought I'd lay it out and give you a bit of a visual on how all these pieces go together. Once you've done your first circuit, it's really quite easy. You may have different ways to deal with it or have a different system that you want to use, but the basics are generally all the same. In the next episode, we'll head out to the front of our property and show you how we go about installing a typical zone using all the components we've just shown you. Stay tuned, it's a little bit of hard work, but it's worth watching, and it will show you how it all goes together and how it becomes operational. Thanks for watching. As I always say, get out there, stay safe, and have fun.